Guys, John here. I want to record a quick dry run of some SMB relay checking, right? So you can see here on the left-hand side, I have one shell running Responder. You still need LLM to effectively do SMB relay. And then I'm using a Python script called SMBRelay.py. So what this is going to do is relay, it's going to respond to a NetBIOS name. And when it sees that NetBIOS name, it's going to redirect the authentication, in this case to a domain controller. But I could also redirect that to an external site where I could start grabbing and harvesting hashes and start grabbing NTLM hashes that I could then later reuse. So the trigger I'm going to use is this LLMNR SMB relay. Let's have a look at it real quick. This is a multi-protocol trigger, right? So the first thing I'm looking for is a couple things. When I do see an LLMNR response, I park that in the session table for 1 second. Now with extrahop, the session table is a piece of memcache that lets me park things so that I can use them if there's a certain TTP that uses multiple protocols. The session table allows me to park things in it, right? So here I'm looking for the resolved address, right? The R adder. And here I've got another one for the name, a variable for the name, and then I've got the client and server. But basically what I'm going to do is park these. And if you look here, there should actually be some stuff in the debug log there. Yeah, so we see it already poisoning WPAD. I've got a couple of honeypots that are pretty roughly infected. So basically I'm looking for WPAD. And we have a deliverable to alert if we resolve WPAD. So we're already looking at that, but for this one I want to look for an SMB relay. So when I see a name being offered by an LLMNR host or a responder host, I park that in the session table. And an interesting thing happens when there's an LLMNR response or someone uses it. There's an immediate NTLM authentication, and what that does is it authenticates over NTLM. Then that hash can then be harvested. So then on the NTLM message, I am looking for, I basically use, pardon the variable, WTF, but I use this variable. I basically look up, is there in the client and server, is there anything in there? Now this only resides in the session table for 1 second. So it's not going to take too much of the session table space. So if within 1 second, and actually this happens within thousandths of a second typically. So we don't have to, in fact, it would be better if I could make these milliseconds up here, then I can make this even faster. That said, we're checking the session table, basically seeing, we've observed an NTLM message. Is there anything in the session table for this combination? If there is, then I check to see if there's a user ID, and if there's a user ID, then a couple of things have happened. First, an NTLM, there's been an NTLM authentication against a server name and a server IP address that was actually offered by a responder host. So here you see responder offering WPAD. If I actually log into WPAD, or if I launch my browser, I will actually authenticate to that server for the name WPAD, and then that will trigger an alert, basically allowing me to basically say, hey, here's a user ID that we believe has probably been compromised. At a minimum, the hash has been compromised. Maybe you need to issue a password change, or maybe we can send an API call to something like Manage Engine or Azure, flagging that so that they have to change the password, right? So those are some of the scenarios. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take my Windows 10 system. And this is a Windows 10 system. I just want to note, with regards to Responder, right? The real-time protection Windows Defender, the endpoint is running here, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look for a server, right? So I'm going to open my Explorer. Let's say I want to go to a share. So I'm going to type in whack SMB server, right? So a couple things I want to do. I'm going to give a little bit of space. So I'm going to try to connect to this server. You can see immediately that LLMNR, the responder, has actually poisoned this. So instead of resolving to SMB server, I'm going to resolve to this particular IP address of the responder, the server doing the responder listening. When this fails, and it eventually will, you'll actually see that there you see the user ID J Smith, and there you see this nice handy hash that we can now steal and either crack it or we can basically use it to do a pass the hash attack. Now I'm forwarding this to my domain controller. So for that reason, you see this object hasn't been granted access rights. So I get an access denied, but the actual authentication was successful. And I have been able to harvest a hash basically by leveraging Responder. And again, this is an example of a multi-protocol trigger where when we observe LLMNR advertising a host, we park that in the session table. And then when we see an NTLM authentication, we simply check it. Hey, was this particular host offered via Responder in the last second? And if it was, we will fire a detection. And in fact, if we come over here and we look at our detections, you'll see that we have an LLMNR auth NTLM, right? So there we actually see it. And if we scroll down, there it is, yep, a couple minutes ago. And we see NTLM auth observed via LLMNR offered host for J Smith. And basically it says the system has basically logged into a device offering LLMNR. And there you see the SMB server. Obviously that's not my domain controller. And you'll see if someone's running Responder, you might see this name change a lot of times as well. And then of course, this is my victim machine. So again, this is the first try run of the WPAD. You also see the WPAD there as well. So we have 5 tests we want to run. One is, do we see the actual WPAD being fired? And then the second one is the actual, did we actually see someone authenticate to a Responder? Basically, what does this mean? This means that the user ID J Smith has been compromised. We need them to change their password. And we need to probably, rebuild this guy or reimage that server. It's been basically impacted. And this person needs a cardboard box. Anyway, this is John Smith with Extra Hop Networks. Thanks.